In today's first reading from the book of Genesis, we get a famous story of Jacob's encounter with an angel, with a man, with the presence of God himself, and they spend the night wrestling. God or this angel or this man touches Jacob's hip and wrenches it, so he walks with a limp from then on. And he's given a new name. He's given the name Israel, someone who contends with God and with people, someone who wrestles with God. This name that's given then to all the children of Israel, the children of Jacob. And so what can that tell us as Catholics, as people living in DC in the year 2021, as parishioners at Holy Trinity? Three things I think that this story might help say something to us today. The first is that God's kind of scary in this story. One of my favorite Jesuits back in Boston when I was in graduate school had a sign above his door that said, "Beware of God," like a beware of dog sign. Now, for a long time, especially for some of you who are older, might have been raised in a Catholic church, might have been part of a Catholic church where the emphasis was always on how scary God was, always on how you were meant to be afraid. And so the complementing that with an awareness of God's loving kindness, an awareness of a God who loves each of us and goes out and comforts us, awareness of the God in the way that Jesus today in the Gospels talks about having pity on our people. That complement is really necessary to have a healthy spirituality, I think. But I think we may have passed a point where we're as much in danger of forgetting that God is scary. God is not us. God's otherness is something that we should walk into carefully. And I think we have a tendency sometimes to domesticate God, to make God fit into our spaces instead of try to fit ourselves into God's more wild spaces. So this might be a lesson for humility about contending with God and about God being the scary all-night struggle. A way to sort of learn to realize that we are not God and that God's plans are not our plans. That's a hard thing for those of us in the greater Washington, D.C. area to sometimes hear. A second thing that I think this story helps tell us is the value here of struggling with God and struggling with each other. You notice that Jacob's reaction, the reaction that is not to sort of give up and stop, but to fight all night long and keep asking for a blessing. The Psalms, I think, are one of my favorite places that's part of the prayer of the church, because the Psalms are not all about praising God as wonderful. They're also about complaining. They're also about being angry. They're also sometimes about whining. They're also sometimes about being scared. They're part of a continuing conversation of God with God's people that becomes the conversation not only of the Jewish people, but of the Christian church. And so when we look at the Psalms, we think the Psalms are really inspired scripture. If we think this story is really inspired scripture, then we have an idea of the life of relationship with God as not being entirely sort of, God says jump and you ask how high, but a relationship where God comes down to our level and wants us to push back, wants us to say what we're really feeling in prayer, not what we think we're supposed to be feeling, wants us to struggle with our emotions, and wants us to bring all of that into our relationship with God, and not just the parts of us that we think are already put together or the parts of us that seem sort of the churchy parts. So we might learn something from Jacob's story about that relationship with God is like any real relationship. It's sometimes a struggle and not just saying yes or no. It's about being present. And the third thing that I think this teaches us is it's about the different images of holiness we get from this story. So we're a far, far world here from Greek and Roman ideas that put the young, the beautiful, the perfect-looking athlete as the height of divinity, or from the versions of that we find in our consumerist society that put youth and perfect skin as that's what the holy looks like. That's what's the most sacred. And instead we have this image of who's the person that God chooses, this old guy who walks away with a limp. In this Ignatian year, we can think about St. Ignatius and about his leg injury and the way in which he becomes a vessel for God's work in the world with his leg injury. It makes me think of Pope Francis, another guy with a leg injury or from a sciatica. He says in the encyclical Evangelii Gaudium, "I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. And so maybe the story of Jacob says something about asking us in our own lives, how do we go out and encounter the real God? How do we go out with humility and awareness of God's otherness? How do we struggle with where God is in our lives and take that as our religious duty and not only blind obedience? And then how do we get ready for the possibility that that might cost us, that that will change us, that encountering God, God touching us, changes us in ways that we might not want or might not expect, but that are much more real and much more perhaps important than staying in the safety of our confined rooms, staying in the safety of our home, and instead going out in the streets, going out in the desert, and wrestling with God, struggling with ourselves.